I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Desiree Rios. Desiree and I met 2 years ago at a nature club group with our kids. We had so much fun together, and as you can guess by now, we've had a lot of conversations about books. We have so much in common in our lives and reading styles, so this should be a really fun episode. She is an avid reader and has prepared an awesome book flight for us today called History Through Stories. You are not going to want to miss it. Welcome to the show, Desiree.
Thanks, Kara. So fun to hear about myself from somebody else.
To see how you are out in the world.
I know. And as you said that, we met at Nature Club and had so many fun conversations about books. I was just, imagining us in my head, just walking up a hiking trail, wearing a baby or carting along another kid and trying to get in all these great conversations about things that we've read, 30 seconds of a conversation split over an hour.
Yes, I specifically remember there was that time we were at the beach and I had to go because it was nap time, and I was trying to tell you about this book and I'm like, we'll talk about it later, because it was just such a mom life conversation.
Yeah,
which is the same as the hiking trail. Well, I'm glad we get to have an uninterrupted conversation today. This is going to be great. Well, why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your reading life?
So I don't know if all your guests say this or most of them, but I've definitely always been a reader. And I can remember being a kid and walking to and from school with a book in my hands, and like running into stuff, and I can't put it down. And for me, it was always an escape into another world. And I would even just, find little nooks and crannies in my house behind the couch and, behind a big recliner or something where nobody would bother me. And I remember feeling like everything else fell away when I was reading. And I still feel like that as an adult. And it's definitely the hobby and passion that I have that I would put over anything else. And I'm starting to see that in my kids too, which I feel like is a gold star. My job here is done,
Yep. Yes, that has been my thing too. I'm like, I want to have a family of readers. Like, we all sit around a fireplace and have family read aloud time every Sunday. Like, this is my ideal dream, and we'll get there one day.
Yeah, one day when chaos isn't ensuing and kids aren't interrupting you and they're not fighting and et cetera, right?
Exactly. So with all that busyness of your life, how do you find time to read?
Well, I think it has to be made sometimes, just like any self-care that we have as moms or as adults. If we want to prioritize something in our lives, we have to make time for it. So I definitely will find those little moments to read where I can, if by the grace of God, I'm having a meal by myself, or I'm having coffee, alone in the morning.
A hot meal by yourself.
Yes, hot coffee and a book in silence is like heaven. Um, but I always make sure to always have a book with me too, if we're out running errands or something like that, and I'm sitting in the car for a few minutes, which is also something I like to model for my kids, being able to pull a book out of my purse instead of pull my phone out and scroll social media, which I do also, but, we try to be, be better in the things we want to do each day. But I probably find my most time for reading at night after the kids have gone to bed. And as you know, my husband is active duty military, just like yours is. And so sometimes when he is traveling or when he's deployed, as hard as that is, there's a little silver lining in there for me.
Yeah.
Like, my evenings are totally free. And I get to put the kids to bed, and I make sure that I don't have anything else to do. My chores are done, my commitments are taken care of, so I can just put them to bed, and the evening is mine to escape into those other worlds.
Yeah, that is what I try to do too, is I try to get everything done before the kids go down because I feel like that's just the closure of the day. Like once the kids hit their pillows, the night is mine.
Yeah. And you look forward to it, right?
Yeah.
I feel like as joyful as it is to be able to stay home with our kids and homeschool them as you and I both do, and we know we're privileged to do that, it's hard and it's an
Hmm.
exhausting day. And so I sometimes wake up in the morning looking forward to that evening time already, right? Like, okay, I got to get through these things and I'm going to do it. And I get this reward at the end of the night.
Yeah, I was going to add too that I think even as a new mom or someone with young babies, I found that, you might be sitting there feeding the baby hour after hour, but I would always have a book with me and that would just help pass the time or soothing the baby and listening to an audiobook as I'm pacing the hallways.
Yeah.
And so I think it can be an escape for, any parent who's in the throes of it, not just those of maybe your husband's not gone, but I know there's also a lot of, spouses that travel a lot for work. So, but just
Yeah.
having that little bit that's your joy in the day helps. And it's
Yeah.
something you can always have. You don't need a babysitter to do it.
Yeah, you can. And I think if you're trying to do it, so many moms, but adults too, who want to add reading into their lives think, oh, I don't have time for that. But as you start trying, you will probably find that there are those little snippets throughout the day that you can make happen for yourself if you really want it.
Yeah. And great point about having the book with you. Because then if you have that snippet of the day, you're prepared. It's right there.
Exactly.
Well, what type of books do you like to read?
I like to read everything. Although, funnily enough, I have a hard time choosing books for myself. So, like when I go to the library, I get really overwhelmed standing in the big stacks, and just
Hmm.
pulling a book out. So, I love when they have those little, tables in the front with like the librarian's picks or, the themes of the month that they have. And I'll be like, oh, that cover looks interesting. I've heard that book before. And I'll just pull a whole bunch of those. And I like to have options because I feel like books for me are sort of like, um, food or clothes or something. You feel like
Hmm.
something different each day, depending on what else is going on. So I like to have a big stack of library books next to my bed. And once I close one, I'll kind of like, okay, what am I feeling like I'm ready for or like I need in my life at this moment?
I also have stacks around the house. My husband kind of makes fun of me because I have like my morning reads and I have my evening reads. Because the mood just strikes me differently, and each stack has 3 to 5 books. And
Yeah. Yeah. And you can have a few different ones that you're reading at the same time, right? For how you're feeling. I saw something on Facebook the other day when I was scrolling instead of
Mhm.
reading. But you find things there, and it said, I like to think of books as, I can't remember exactly what it said, but it compared it to a wine cellar, right? You don't have to drink all that wine as soon as you buy it, but you'll go into your wine cellar and you feel like, oh, I need a nice red tonight, or I've been saving this one for a really special occasion, and then you get to pull it out. Which I thought, oh, that's great because I, like you, have stacks of books that you haven't read that might strike you at a different time.
Well, that is perfect for the show being bookish flights, right? The impetus being a flight of books. It's going to be a tasting or a sampling of books that pair well together. So, this is the perfect segue, I
There you
think, to
go.
start jumping into your book flight today, which is History Through Stories. And I am loving the books that we are going to chat about today. So, do you want to tell us about the first one that we'll be sampling?
So the first one that I chose for our History Through Stories bookish flight was Ken Follett's Kingsbridge novels. And there are, it's a trilogy, and then he came out with a prequel as well. So there's actually four total. But the first one that blew up the series really is called Pillars of the Earth. And this whole series starts in the Middle Ages. And I love it because this author, Ken Follett, all of his works that I have devoured teach you so much about the time period in which he's writing. So you're not only really connecting with the characters and the plot, but you're learning so much about what life was like at that time. And that is one of the reasons I have really taken to him as an author, because I hated history growing up. I
Hmm.
hated those classes in high school and in college. I would never read what they told me to, even though I was an avid reader, because I just didn't connect to it and I didn't have any reason to want to learn about it. But when we learn about the past through vibrant characters that we connect to, it's easier for us to remember those things. And that has been what has made me fall in love with Ken Follett as an author. So Pillars of the Earth takes place in the Middle Ages, and it's about a man who is so what I'm looking for. He is hired to build the greatest Gothic cathedral of all time. And so it goes years and years and years through his plans to build this. But you're learning about the wars that are going on at the time, and the rivalries between church and state, and all the big names in history that we learn about in high school that you never really connect to, and you start to see, oh, this is how it all really comes together. So those are a favorite for me for that reason.
I think this was the first book for me that made me realize, ooh, I really like historical fiction. And then
Mhm.
ever since then, it has cracked open my world. I remember reading this back when we lived in Hawaii at our first duty station. So, way back in the early 2010s, and just devouring the whole series. Like, these are quite lengthy books, but they are so worth it. I promise. He does such a great job of immersing you in this time period. You'll love it. Like, I love the books where I feel like I'm learning, but there's also a great storyline that's
Yes,
running
because you
through
don't
it.
feel like you're learning, right? You
Yeah.
don't feel like you're opening up a textbook. But I've told people about this book so many times and have said I've learned more through these books than I did through years in a classroom. Um, and it's just, and so it feels like leisure, but you're also, educating yourself at the same time. And I have friends, and my kids will joke with me too, because I start so many conversations with, oh, I read about this in a book, or I learned in a book, and they kind of roll their eyes and they're like, okay, but
Here mom goes again. Yeah,
um,
I the only thing honestly I really remember about history was just that rote memorization to try to pass the test or whatever it was. I really unfortunately didn't take much out of it. So, I totally
yeah,
agree with you on learning through stories because as an adult I feel like I've kind of learned it all again in a good way
yeah, yep, exactly.
and something that's retainable too.
Yes, yes. And as I was preparing to talk to you about these books, I haven't picked them up in a while. I read the prequel that came out a couple years ago when it came out, and as I was kind of pulling them up again in my mind, I was like, oh, I need to read them again. I'm excited to jump into it one more time. So, and that's what I love about books too, is that it's not one and done. When you read it 10 years later, 20 years later, you're in a different spot. And so you might pick up something that you hadn't before, or it might hit you in a different way.
Yeah, we this year for our book club reread. Well, for me, I reread Anne of Green Gables, which I had not read since I was a child, and it hit me so differently. Like, I resonated with different characters in the book this
Mm-hmm.
time, now being a mother
Yeah.
and not being a child. And it was, I don't reread much, but that gave me like, ooh, maybe I should reread more. Cause like you said, you're just at a completely different period of your life. You've had more life experiences and you'll relate differently totally to the book.
Yeah. I have read Anne probably 5 times over the entire series. And my oldest son, who's 10, has read the graphic novels.
Oh, I didn't even know they had some.
I think it's just, well, he's only read the first one. I think that's the one that
Okay.
they've made into a graphic novel. But um, yeah, I resonate with different characters with her each time too. And it's those are the books that I want to have a highlighter with the whole time. And actually most of them, I feel like I always want to like have a book journal and highlight
Mm-hmm.
in all my books these beautiful passages and these meaningful phrases that you want to carry with you. And savor for longer than you really can. And I've never done it. I don't know if I ever will, but I have one in my head.
I started one last year just for that reason and writing down the quotes, like you said, because I don't often go back to the book to open it, or I read a lot of library books where I can't annotate.
Right,
And so
right.
I'm like, okay, well, and so I ended up grabbing a journal last year and writing some favorite quotes down and thought one day maybe I'd share it with my children. I had this like grandiose idea. We'll see if that comes to fruition.
Well,
So,
I love to hear that you've actually done it. Maybe that will inspire me to do the same thing.
yeah.
So,
All right. Well, anything else you'd like to add about our first book?
um, gosh, oh, I would like to say that if you've never read historical fiction, or if you haven't read these huge chunks of books like a Ken Follett 1,000 pager, to not let yourself be intimidated by it. Because you can do it piece by piece. And as you get through, the beginning and have kind of fallen in, it will go so fast. And I know a lot of people like to do books on the e-readers and things like that. I'm definitely more of a hold it in your hand kind of
Mm-hmm.
girl. Um, but if a really huge book intimidates you, then maybe on an e-reader would be helpful too, because you're not having that visual of, what you have to get through. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I was trying to think. I don't think there's like any maps or depictions of the church that were in this book. I think it just was the front cover, right? So you don't necessarily need to have it as a hard copy.
yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, that was The Pillars of the Earth, which is the first book of the Kingsbridge series by Ken Follett. All right. What's our second book we'll be sampling today?
So our second one is a series as well, because I can't follow the rules.
This is how we get more books in the flight.
Exactly, exactly. And so this one is called the Mark of the Lion series by Francine Rivers. And the first book in it is called A Voice in the Wind. And this is technically historical fiction also, but it's also Christian fiction. Um, and this is a book that was recommended to me by my grandmother.
I
And
love that.
and again, holding it in my hands and opening it up reminds me of her too, which is, that's a whole other tangent. Um, but this book is set in about 70 AD in Jerusalem. So a few decades after Christ was born and died, and it's during the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the Jews, and the war that goes on between them. And so you're getting a lot of um, Christian principles and ideas and faith-based characters in this book, but at the same time, you are being taken back to a historical point that, whether or not you're a Christian, happened. Um, so all the history in that aspect was really interesting to me too, and being able to put real facts and people and happenings to these things that I had learned as in church or in Sunday school growing up, that maybe not everybody believes, but there are other parts that are fact no matter what. So
Mm-hmm.
that's um, an interesting take on that, I think.
The few books I have read that have been like a fictionalized account of a biblical story, again, like you said, kind of back to the first book we talked about, it gave me such a picture of that where I might have not made those same connections with just reading the Bible verse, but to delve into one specific character or that period of history, it gave me such a better picture and I think understanding of the biblical story in itself. So
Yeah.
I have not read this one in particular, but I've loved those books of Christian fiction for that reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when you think about, because I know Francine Rivers, her ministry is her books, and so all her characters um, are working through spiritual issues, or deciding on what their relationship with God is going to be. But Ken Follett, he writes a lot about the church and religious characters and things like that as well, because that does have so much to do with history too, all over the world. But he's actually an atheist. And a lot of his characters have really strong spiritual religious ties. So it's interesting to see how two authors who are from completely different
Yeah.
sides of the spectrum, put that in differently.
Wow.
But in the Mark of the Lion, the main character, Hadassah, is a Jewish slave girl whose family has been killed by Roman soldiers. And she's taken in as a slave to a Roman home. And so it's about her deciding who she's going to be in this home that is so different from the way that she grew up, and how she's going to speak her truth and speak the gospel to a family whose entire life is intentionally closing off to what she's trying to do, and how God works in ways that we just can't understand. And so that's a book that I have read over and over and over. And every time really speaks something different to me, based on where I am in my faith and where I am in my life. And it's a book that I never keep in my house, because every time I buy a new copy, I just give it to somebody else when I'm done. And that's something that I think is really special about books too. And I don't ever really feel bad about buying new ones, because when I do, I know that I'm going to be passing them along to other people. And I hope that they will do the same thing. And it makes you think about like those old library cards that you used to have, and you
Yes.
could see who else was checking them out. And that would be something fun to do in books as you're passing them on. Everybody write a little note in there about how this affected you and pass it on.
That would be great. I always think of myself like I kind of am book matchmaking a little bit with my friends, like you said, like, oh, I
Yeah.
think she would really like this book, so I'm going to pass it to her, or whoever I pass it along to. I'm kind of thinking about them as I'm reading them. And so I love that. We actually were at the San Diego Public Library recently, and we found a book that had one of those old library cards in there. And I mean, I felt like it was like a relic. I'm like, oh, kids, come over here. And like, there's the old library card. Like, because they've literally never seen one. And that is not for lack of us frequenting the library. So,
Yeah, I know it's crazy to think about what it's going to be like for them when they're adults, and that's part of the reason why I feel like I'm such a um, original book type of person, because that might be gone one day, and I think there's something about being able to hold something in your hands and flip back the pages, oh, I remembered what they said about that, or I need to clarify that. And just the smell and the feel. And I look at all these words on paper, and I think about the author, sitting there and typing it or writing it out by hand if it was a really long time ago. And there's just so much that goes into it that makes it feel really special.
yeah, I've, thought about as I've been doing this show, like, okay, well, there's some books obviously that don't work for me. And everybody's going to have books that don't work for them. But I'm like, probably, I'm not going to go out and book bash, because I know how much this author put into to make this work happen. And it probably just means that it just wasn't the right book for me. And maybe it's just not the right time for me to read this book. It could be the right book later. But I know
Yeah.
I can appreciate the amount of time and work that goes into creating that
Yeah.
book.
And it is hard to not book bash sometimes, because, when you're reading something and you're like, really? Like,
Yeah.
how did this get through sometimes? But that's a good perspective to have on it. Somebody was writing from their life, from their experiences, and could speak to somebody else that it didn't, in the way, just like these books that we love, probably aren't for everybody else. And that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, anything else you'd like to add about the Mark of the Lion series or The Voice in the Wind?
And I think just the same with historical fiction. If you don't like history, or if a really huge book is intimidating to you, if you are not a spiritual person or you're not a Christian, just because something is labeled Christian fiction, maybe don't let that deter you. Give it a shot anyway, because I mean, the story itself is good, even if you don't align with the foundation. So,
Yeah, and I meant to say when we were talking about her, but about Hasid and how being a slave in this home, and her probably grappling with how she was going to continue to maintain who she was as a person of faith, and being a slave in the home. That was probably a huge, you know, bit of courage, right?
yeah,
And bravery to
absolutely.
show up
Yeah.
like that.
Yep. Story of a
So,
strong female character who's going to be who she is no matter what. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, great. Well, I'm excited. I'm adding that one to my TBR.
Yay. I can't wait to hear what you think.
All right. So that was the Mark of the Lion series, and specifically the first book being the Voice in the Wind series, or Voice in the Wind book by Francine Rivers. And then what's our last book today?
So the last one, I sort of hesitated to add this one in because I didn't want it to be cliche, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who still haven't read it. And it's The Help by Catherine Stockett. And if you haven't read the book, you've probably seen the movie or at least heard of it. But this is a little more contemporary fiction in that it's not, Middle Ages or 70 AD. And I think it only came out, what, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe
Gosh,
even
has it
less.
even been that long? I'm like terrible with time.
Yeah. And but it's set in 1960s, Jackson, Mississippi, and it's a story about a white privileged woman is who writes a book based on the experiences of the help or of the servants who work in these privileged white homes. And I think that this one is really interesting because the author is a white privileged woman who had help in her home growing up. And she has said that she hesitated to write the book because she didn't feel like it was necessarily her story to tell. Um, but it was her story, as this was
Mm-hmm.
the experience that she had had growing up. But she wanted to make sure that she was honoring the culture and the experience of Black women taking care of other people's families, of white women's families, and what they had to go through in that. And so this one, as history through stories, definitely hit more closer to home because it was, only 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still seeing the effects of so much of this in our day to day in our country. But I think it was brave to to take that leap out and write these stories down because history, as we again to be cliche, we hear the history was written by the victors, right? And so we have to be careful when we are pulling things that we're going to believe from history and teaching it to our children, where we're getting our information from. Um, but I think that, where was I going with that? That it was brave of her to do so because this is it. She was using her platform and her privilege to give voice to people
Mm-hmm.
who otherwise would not have had that voice. And that was what the main character in the book, Skeeter Phelan, was wanting to do as well. She knew that if she put something out, it was going to be listened to, and that these women had stories that needed to be told for many reasons. And again, the main character, Skeeter, comes up against a lot of obstacles and has a lot of fear about what she is going to be putting out into the world because of the racial tension and political tension during that time. But sometimes when we jump off of that cliff, not knowing what's going to happen at the end, there are beautiful ripples that come out from that. So I think that's an inspiring model for us.
Absolutely. I did not know that about the author, that she was using kind of her background, or her, growing up, her experiences from the book. I didn't know that.
I think it's really cool to look at where the author is coming from,
Mm-hmm.
when they were writing their books and their reasons for it, because yeah, it gives you a different perspective on the story as a whole.
Do you
Um,
usually research before or after you read the story about the author? How do you do that?
Usually after,
Okay.
and I'll read about the author at the very end and then kind of rabbit hole from there. Um, but the Catherine Stockett actually, the last I heard, has not released anything else, and people have been, her agent, etc., have been asking her, well, what's the next thing that you're going to put out? And she has said she doesn't want to do anything else or is nervous to let anything else come out because of the success of The Help, because that was her first novel. And
Okay.
so she's like, oh, I don't know, you know. Um, but yeah, there's so much that goes into writing a novel, like we were saying earlier. And it's, someone's life, someone's soul, someone's experiences, which is partly why it's important to not negatively critique or over negatively critique people's books, because there's so much more to it than just the words on the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a book that I think I very rarely watch TV, not many movies, just because I would prefer to read a book in the quietness of the evening.
Yes.
But this was one that I saw the movie as well, and I think they actually did a very good job with the rendition of the movie and keeping it true to the story that was in the
Yeah, I
book
thought
as
so,
well.
because many book lovers would probably agree, right, that the book is better than the movie, and
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to watch uh, movies or shows based off of books that you love, because we create these pictures in our heads, and when it's different than that, it feels like somebody's stealing it from you almost. Um, but yeah, I was pleasantly surprised with this one as well, and it's one that doesn't get old for me
Yeah.
to
This could
watch
probably
over.
be a good reread too. I was just thinking, I'm like, gosh, it's been a long time since I've read it. There's a line that I tell my daughter when she used to nap, I would tell her, you're beautiful, you're smart, and you are important. And I would tell
Yes.
her that every nap time. I don't put her to bed much anymore because my youngest insists that mommy put him to bed right now. So my husband does the big kids. But yeah, it's like, yeah, I think that's so important for her to
Mhm.
hear. So.
Absolutely. And hopefully she carries it with her, even if you're not doing bedtime anymore.
Oh yeah, I'm sure she does, and like little snippets of things she'll say. So
From what I remember of her, she definitely knows that
yeah,
she's beautiful and kind and important and strong.
yes. All right. Well, anything else you'd like to add about that one?
Um, I think that one's covered.
Okay, so that was The Help by Catherine Stockett. And then I would like to give you a little dessert pairing today as a thank you for coming on the show. I have a couple books that I had written down for you, and I'm going to give you the option. You can choose what period you would like to learn about. So I have one that is about China in the 19th century. I have one that's about the Civil War, and then another one actually about a Benedictine cloistered convent of nuns. So,
Ooh,
which way would you like to go?
cool. Well, I wouldn't call myself a Civil War junkie, but I definitely love anything that has to do with that period. So I think I'm going to take that one.
Okay, so the one I'm thinking of for you is called The Widow of the South, and that is by Robert Hicks. Is that one you're familiar with?
No, I haven't even heard of it.
Okay, so this one takes place it's set in Franklin, Tennessee, and the year is 1864, and it's the height of the Civil War. And unfortunately for our main character, her name is Carrie McGavick, the war happens to be at the doorstep of her home. And the battle that ensues in Franklin, Tennessee leaves 10,000 wounded men or dying men right in her area. And she lives in a large home in the area. So her home quickly becomes a makeshift hospital to care for these wounded and dying men. And she doesn't have much training, but the doctors and everybody, she lets everybody into her home, the medics that are taking care of these men, and they're all coming in. They're ripping up all her beautiful towels from her home to use as bandages for these men. And she is just, it kind of lands in her lap, right? Like she's not prepared that this was
Yeah.
going to happen. Um, so what ensues in these pages it was incredible. I cried. And listeners who've been with me for a little bit, I cry in most books.
I'm gonna say that's a sign of a good book if it makes me cry.
I cried multiple times over this book, just from the characters that you meet, these men that come in, and in particular, this man who actually was a Yankee soldier, so opposite, right? Because she lived on the Confederacy side. Um, and he really was ready to die. And she saw something in this man where she's like, no. And that kind of just lit the spark underneath her. I mean, she had already opened up her home, but she just took to this man and was like, I'm not going to let him go. Like, he's going to make it out of here. And so she kind of, there's a, some things that maybe happen between these two characters. Um, and it is just a beautiful story about her. It actually is a true story.
Oh, love it.
It is a historical fiction, but it's based on a true
Right.
story. And she just the dignity that she gives to these men, and whether they pass away, they end up having a graveyard on the land of her property, because she's like, well, how do I give dignity to these men that died? And no matter what side of the line they were on, it didn't matter if they were Confederate or Yankee soldiers, contacting the families to let them know where their loved ones had died, and just everything she did. It was an incredible story. And I hope I didn't spoil it, because I don't think you learn till the end that it is a true story, but it just makes it that much better
Yeah,
of a
absolutely.
story when you learn that it was based on a true story and someone actually did this. And I love books like this that make me think, would I do the same? If that situation showed up on my doorstep, would I do the same thing?
Yeah. Well, and that's why we learn history, right? To learn from the past, to help us be able to make better decisions about the future, just with us as individuals, but also for society as a whole. And so being able to, yeah, close a book and know that you learned something from it and that you can be a better person for it, just really feels like,
Yeah.
yes.
And that moment that you sit there, like, I sometimes will close it and just sit there for a few minutes to think about it, right? Like, it just stays with you and you're pondering it. It's really a good story. So I hope that you enjoyed that
I
one.
can't wait.
All right. So that was The Widow of the South by Robert Hicks as our dessert pairing. So what we'll do to end our episode is what I call our bonus pairings. And they're just a round of speed questions you can answer really quick. And we'll do that to finish up.
Yay.
So where is your favorite place to read?
My favorite place to read, I would say in bed, with my little side light on and maybe a bowl of popcorn next to me, or something like that. But anywhere where it's silent the rest of
Yes.
the
I have a hard time reading with background noise. Like, I really have to be in the quiet.
Mhm.
All right. And then what is one book that you have read that has changed your life?
Um, I mean, we already talked about Anne of Green Gables, and I think about her as a mother a lot, reading the entire series. Um, I think if I had to choose one, though, another another Francine Rivers book, called Redeeming Love, and that is actually an analogy of a book in the Bible, and it's about how God chases after us over and over and over again, no matter how far we go and what we do to turn away from Him. But He uses the romantic relationship between the two characters in the book, a farmer and a prostitute, who he makes his wife and who he chases after her over and over and over again. And it makes me almost cry just talking about it and knowing how loved we are, and that nothing we can do will ever change that. So
Yeah,
and that's
it is.
another one that I give away over and over.
It is a beautiful story. I think actually you and then I have another friend, Brittany, that recommended that book to me. And then I was like, all right, I'm picking it up. So, and
There you
it
go.
was a beautiful book. I really enjoyed reading that.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
All right. Which do you prefer? I think you've already answered this. Do you listen to audiobooks at all, or do you do only hard copy?
I do hard copies for myself, but
Okay.
my kids and I do audiobooks a lot
Fun.
together. I can't concentrate on my own adult book as much when there's, everything going on. But we listen to audiobooks in the car a lot. We do a lot of driving, traveling, and that's one of my favorite things that I get to do with my kids, especially as a homeschool parent. It brings up incredible conversations, and tons of laughter and memories. And they now listen to audiobooks on their own all the time. They each have an Alexa in their room. And if I had a nickel for every time I heard Alexa, play Ramona Quimby, Alexa, play Harry Potter, Alexa,
Oh, I love
um,
that.
my oldest is has just started listening.
Alexa's really
Alexa.
responsive. That is too good.
I love it.
Oh, that was good.
Yeah, so that's been really great for us because not only are they, getting this love of reading that they can do without me, even if they're not, proficient readers yet themselves, but they can listen to the same things over and over and get something different out of it every time, just like we were saying earlier. And it has really bonded us, I think, as them as siblings and us as, kids and mom. So that's really special to me.
Yeah, I've used that actually as when my kids drop the nap, like, hey, we still are going to do quiet time. We'll still all have like our 30-minute break in the day. You can go to your room and do whatever you want, but an audiobook is an option of something that they can choose to do. We all have our, 30 minutes of space in the day. So, all right. And then last question, what are you reading next?
I currently just picked up from the library from one of their, little tables, like I was saying. It's called Songs in Ursa Major.
Okay.
And I don't have it next to me. And I can't remember who the author is. But it is set in late 1960s, early 70s, the music scene. And it's about a man who is a huge up and coming rock star, gets in a motorcycle accident, and this sort of local hometown, no one really knows about them, band has to take their place at a music festival, take his place. But then she ends up caring for him after his accident. She's a nurse as well. And so it's about their relationship and the music industry. But I'm only a few chapters in, but so far it reminds me very much of Daisy Jones and the Six, which I cried. It stuck with me. That book was absolutely incredible. But yeah, I have a whole list. My sisters and I have a little chat on Facebook, and everything that we're always reading, we post it in there. And okay, this is the next one. This is the next one. So I always have something to pull from if I'm not sure what my next recommendation is going to be. So it's fun.
I think that's great to have that. You have either I'm an only child, but you have either your sisters or I have my friends that I consider my sisters, right? That I'm like, okay, tell me the next book, or we're trying to read the same book around the same time so we can discuss it. So it's good to have that little crew of people.
Yeah. We're not the only book crazies out there in the world. There's lots of us.
Yes, we are, and we're going to make our kids them too.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with me today. I know your time is really precious, so I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Kara. It was so fun. It's so fun to have something for us that we get to do, and I was so honored that you picked me out of all your book friends to do it. I'd love to do it again.
Thank you for listening to Desiree Rios and I and our discussion today on her History Through Stories book flight. We'd love to hear what other books you might pair with this book flight at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information on today's flight and any other books that we talked about today. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are picking up next, especially if you have heard about the book on the show, please tag us. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. This is a brand new show, so if you enjoyed it, please head over to Apple Podcasts and give the show a review. Your review not only helps me, but it also helps the show reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure that you will not miss an episode. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.